After 25 years working for peace and reconciliation, people ask me all the time, why are you doing this? Why are you going to places like the Middle East when you have MS? How can I carry on doing this? How can I not? How can I sit and do nothing while Christians are being burned alive in cages? Girls are being sold as sex slaves. Families are being destroyed. Homes are pillaged. The only way to overcome darkness is by being the light. I'll keep on fighting for peace until my dying breath. To be honest, when I started all this, I couldn't have imagined what it would lead to.
Today, our Christian brothers and sisters in many countries are facing persecution and martyrdom on an unprecedented scale.
Believers face torture, beheadings, rape. ISIS executed 21 Egyptian Christians. The situation for Iraqi Christians is dire. In Pakistan,
Nigeria,
India,
North Korea,
Eritrea,
Syria, Iraq,
is the worst Holocaust that the world had ever known.
Christians have been persecuted from the very beginning. We all know of Stephen, the first martyr, who was stoned to death. John the Baptist, who had his head cut off. The first apostles, who were murdered in violent ways. And under the Emperor Nero, ordinary Christians were tortured and thrown into arenas to be eaten alive by wild animals. That's history. But what about today? The reality is that over 200 million Christians around the world are experiencing extreme levels of persecution right now. That's more than 3 times the entire population of the United Kingdom. A small percentage of people are doing something, but mostly people in the West are unaware of the extent to which Christians are being persecuted. Or even worse, they are aware, but they are indifferent to it.
There is over 165,000 Christians was killed for their faith. Just last year. There is between 200 and 300 million persecuted Christians worldwide, and the world is remaining silent about it. It's the worst Holocaust that the world had ever known, and even the churches here doesn't know about it.
My friends at Open Doors, who work with the persecuted church, compile a world watch list that ranks the top 50 countries in the world where Christians face the worst persecution. And according to their research, persecution is on the increase. It's getting worse.
The level of persecution and oppression of Christians around the world continues to increase in many countries. Over 3,000 Christians are known to have been killed for their faith during the reporting period, a figure which is twice as high as last year. North Korea sadly continues to top the list as the most difficult place on the planet to be a Christian. But there is also real concern about other countries, such as Egypt, Nepal, and India. In Pakistan, for instance, 168 churches have been attacked, and the situation faced by many Christians in Afghanistan has worsened since the last report by Open Doors. So for many around the world, their Christian faith puts them at imminent physical risk of attack.
When we talk about persecution, you need to know that it differs in intensity from place to place. In the West, it might be more subtle, but in Iraq and Syria, it is most certainly not. It is a matter of life and death. People are held at gunpoint. They had their families killed. They've seen their loved ones massacred in front of them. They've been asked to give up everything for their faith in Jesus.
Persecution comes in a variety of ways. In the Middle East, and particularly under ISIS, it comes in the cruelest way of burning people inside a cage, crucifying them, children, particularly in front of their parents. In the West, we're a little bit more polite. The persecution form varies. People lose their jobs, and people basically can lose their dignity, they can lose their position in society, wherever it may be. But that's kind of, it's a persecution, but it's kind of has a nice package wrapped around it. But it's persecution nonetheless.
We would say that persecution is any hostility that people experience as a result of their attachment to Jesus Christ. And we talk about the smash and the squeeze. So the smash, as you'd expect, tends to be the sort of things we read about in the paper. Murder, execution, kidnapping, imprisonment, rape, forced marriage, those sorts of things. The squeeze is actually much more pervasive and much more insidious, and that is about gradually removing people's rights to live as an equal citizen within the society. You know, there are a whole number of ways in which your freedom is just gradually squeezed and you're gradually suffocated, basically. The squeeze often results in a smash. So the squeeze can go on for many years, and gradually people are withdrawn from society and then imprisoned and then tortured and then killed and so on. So the two do go together. And I think a lot of Christians in the West don't understand what it's like to live in a society where your basic rights are gradually being taken away from you.
Nowhere is Christianity more steadily and systematically under fire than in the Middle East, which is where I've spent the last 25 years of my life. Why are Christians in such danger? There are many reasons, but the bottom line is Christianity in certain countries in the Middle East may die out completely if we do not do something.
There are three main reasons why Christians are being persecuted. The first is where the government, there's a national reason why people are not allowed to practice their Christian faith. So in a country like North Korea, Kim Jong-un is considered to be a god, as is his father and his grandfather. So anyone practicing Christianity or any other faith, come to that, would put their faith above Kim Jong-un and the prevailing ruling party. So that's a main reason why Christians are being persecuted in countries like North Korea. So they're under surveillance. There are 70,000 Christians being detained in detention camps in North Korea at the moment. The second reason is around religious persecution, particularly in countries where Christians are in the minority. So, for example, in Niger, which is 98% Islamic, Christians come under a lot of pressure from the Muslims in their community are often killed, driven out of the village, and so on. In India, which we're becoming increasingly worried about, Hindu nationalism is on the rise. So there's an increasing amount of persecution of Christians from Hindus across the country, churches being burnt, pastors being killed. The third reason is just where there are very poor human rights, and people just aren't able to exercise the freedoms that we would usually take for granted. So in Eritrea, for example, there's a real absence of freedoms of speech and human rights, and Christians are being severely persecuted there. So Eritrea is actually number 6 on the list this year.
Let's take Egypt, for example, where there are large numbers of Coptic Christians, about 15 million, that's 10% of the population. They've been facing increasing violence over the years. The latest atrocity that made international headlines was on Palm Sunday in 2017. 2 bombs went off in different churches. 49 innocent people were killed.
Egypt's president declared a 3-month state of emergency following terror attacks on 2 separate churches Sunday. The attacks killed at least 44 and injured more than 120.
Security cameras showed this suicide bomber outside St. Mark's Cathedral in Alexandria just before he blew himself up. 2 hours earlier, a bomb went off inside St. George's Church in Tanta during their Palm Sunday service. ISIS claimed responsibility for both deadly attacks. They warned of more to come. Earlier in the year, they released a video claiming Egyptian Christians were infidels and their favorite prey.
Imagine these people all dressed up, carrying palms, going to church, and these bombs just obliterate some of these little girls, little boys, little kids. That tore me up. I mean, there are so many things that I see that just devastate me. But here's what the pastors and the church leaders, these are the heads of the denominations, told me. That according to their statistics, the following weekend, on Easter Sunday, collective church attendance were about 3 million more Christians who went to church that Easter than the previous year. This is to me the most, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. They were saying to the terrorists, we're not afraid of you killing us, we're going to church. The incredible faith of these people in the midst of absolute horror. Blood and flesh scattered everywhere. But then the next Sunday, they went to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And in many ways, they were celebrating the resurrection of these precious people who died the week before.
The Middle East is where Christianity started. Here we find the ancient churches that the West knows little or nothing about. These brothers and sisters of ours have been living in the lion's den for centuries. Like the Coptic Church in Egypt, like the Syriac Church. Many of my peoples from Iraq are from these Orthodox churches.
The Syriac Christians basically faced persecution since the early Christianity. And because of that, they're also called the Church of Martyrs, the Church of Persecution. But still, the greatest change in our time, if I say in our time, last century and this century, it happened through the genocide of 1914 and 1915, and now through the Iraq War and the Syrian War. If we look at numbers, if you let the numbers speak as a factor of the impact of this 100 years history, before 1914, at the end of the 19th century, The Syriac Christianity, it was present in Turkey, it was present in Syria properly, it was present in Iraq. But now, 100 years later, we came to a situation where we're just about symbolically still present. And now it's disappearing and disappearing. One of our bishops of the Syriac tradition in Iraq, he was kidnapped and very brutally, even as they video him, cutting his left hand, his right hand, and he didn't convert, and then cutting also his legs until they totally cut his head and killed him, and even sent the video to his wife. I mean, why does this need to happen?
Even in Israel, it's not easy to be a Christian. To head up a Christian ministry here, you've got to be deeply committed to Jesus and his people. My dear friend, Pastor Naim Hori, in Bethlehem, leads a truly born-again, spirit-filled congregation, but at great personal cost.
The house of the Lord tonight and worship in the city of Bethlehem, the birthplace of our Lord Jesus Christ. We give all the glory to God tonight.
We are in our church in Bethlehem, the largest evangelical, born-again Christian, filled with Spirit church in the city of Bethlehem. I started this church 40 years ago. In the Middle East especially, Christians been under heavy persecution, especially the last 30, 40 years, 50 years. I can see the reason why, because the word of God start to be spread more and more and more in the Middle East, which in the past we didn't have any Christian TVs talking about Jesus. But now it's more persecution because so many people start to hear more evangelical groups talking about Jesus, evangelizing, preaching, teaching, singing, all about Christ and the teaching of Christ. And I think that's the reason, because of that, we are now under very difficult time and persecution. Even here in our church was bombed 14 times, and I was shot 4 bullets, and one hit my left shoulder, and I'm still alive, hallelujah.
These churches, these Christians are our family. Would we not do anything to make their suffering a bit more bearable? We have to ask ourselves, are we going to ignore their plight because it's inconvenient? It makes me think of the story of the Good Samaritan. A man had been attacked, and all the religious people simply walked past him. They just pretended they did not see his suffering, because to stop and help him would have been inconvenient. Only a Samaritan came to his aid, and the Samaritans were not even seen as the real good Jews. Yet the Samaritan had a compassionate heart, and his compassion moved him to action. If we claim to know and serve God, we must do no less. The Samaritans are still here to this day. They're being horribly persecuted over the centuries. So there is only a very small number of them left.
The number of the Samaritans before 3,000 years, 3 million. When the Israelis split two kingdoms, South Judah, capital Jerusalem, North Israelites, capital Shechem, Nablus. We are from the kingdom of North, from Israelites. In this time when the Israelis split, the number of the Samaritans, 3 million people. But in the 1917, before 100 years ago, the number of the Samaritans, 146 persons. If you want to ask me why, because Assyrian, Babylon, Parsim, Yavanim, Romaim, Byzantium, Muslim, every country came here, killed the Samaritans. I wrote the history of the Samaritans. I remember the history when all the people we killed the Samaritans. No, now this is not good. So every time we pray to the God in the synagogue, our synagogue, to be peace. I afraid about the future on the community. The Samaritans, we haven't land, we haven't business. Half from the Samaritans, we don't work. This is realist. We have 3 passports now, Palestinian, Jordanian, Israelites. This is help us. But until now, we need many things. I think all the world, we must learn from the Samaritans. What to learn from the small sect in the world, from the community of the world? To learn, the war is not good for the world.
I worked in anesthetics and surgery, as you know. I was a gas man from South London. But then God called me to become an Anglican priest. And as a priest, I realized how important it was to make peace between religions. So this was my calling, to be a priest and a medic. I studied at Cambridge. And for 4 years, I had great interest in Judaism and visited Israel a lot. And there it was prophesied that my life would be devoted to peace in the Middle East. So naturally, I assumed my work would be in Israel and the Palestinian areas. I never thought that God would send me to Iraq, of all places. So later, when I became a canon at Coventry Cathedral, and I was asked to head up the International Centre for Reconciliation, with a mandate to promote reconciliation in the Middle East, it all started coming together for me. That was in 1998, the same year that I was diagnosed with MS. From then on, I had 2 battles to fight, one with my own body and the other for peace in the Middle East. What many people don't understand is that in the Middle East, you cannot separate politics and religion. Religion is their identity and way of living. But when religion goes wrong, it goes very wrong. And then we as a church need to be there to find solutions. Take it from a man who has been part of both the religious and political sides. A rabbi, a former politician, my dear friend, Chief Rabbi Michael Melchior.
I also had a period for my sins where I became a politician. I was a cabinet minister in the Israeli cabinet government. I was for 3 periods in the Knesset. And at the same time, I worked in the parallel world, working on relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And we worked together with Canon Andrew White, who is really not only a friend and not only a student, but also a teacher and also a messenger of God. A messenger of God who has devoted his life, endangered his life, put his life on the line for so many years in the same spirit to fight for those who are oppressed. But to fight for them is not only to save them physically, to save them spiritually. It's also to build a new civilization together. The vast majority of the peoples here look towards religion as their major source of identity, of belonging. And therefore, if you say to people, you have to choose between peace, which will be a secularization, it will be something which will change the place you're living in. It will be a secularized society, totally. So you can choose between that, and you can then choose your identity, your belonging, your belief. Then people choose their identity and their belonging. They don't choose the peace. Because people don't want a cheap version of a westernization of their society. They don't want God out of the equation.
So I go and speak to people who are supposed to be my enemies, different religious leaders. I even invited ISIS to dinner. That didn't go very well. They said, yes, we will come, but afterwards we'll chop off your head. Why do I go and speak with my enemies? Well, who's my enemy? It is a person whose story I have not heard. So I listen to their stories and I talk with them and we become friends. And if we are friends, we can make peace. There are many of us who work together, like Chief Rabbi Michael Melchior. He has worked very closely with me on many peace negotiations. The biggest was the Alexandria Accord in 2002, where we managed to bring together more than a dozen senior Christian, Jewish, Muslim leaders who pledged to work together for a just and lasting peace in the region.
I had some good relations with my Palestinian counterpart, who was a minister in the kind of Palestinian government, who was a religious leader, very, very thoughtful and important. And that was when we decided to make Alexandria, to have the first summit meeting. And nobody believed it could happen. It was at the peak of the Intifada, when everybody was just, nobody was talking, everybody was fighting each other. We brought together all the leaders, made the Alexandria Declaration, which was an inspiration for the whole world.
Only a few people knew about the Alexandria Accord because the media was too scared to report on it. They thought we'd all blow each other up, but we didn't. As a result of the Alexandria Agreement, we set up youth centers in Israel called Mosaica. And my friend, who is also Alexandria participant, Sheikh Imad Fallujah, set up brother and sister centers in the West Bank. He actually was one of the founders of the Hamas and a trusted member of Yasser Arafat's government. These centers are still going strong today, 16 years later.
أنا أقول إنه يجب حل قضايا الشرق الأوسط بالطرق السلمية حتى نحاصر كل الأفكار المتطرفة. لا يمكن أن تنتهي الأفكار المتطرفة طالما بقيت الأسباب التي وجدت لأجلها. هناك ظلم، التطرف هو وليدة الظلم، وليدة القهر، وليدة انعدام الحرية والديمقراطية في المنطقة. يجب أن نعزز الديمقراطية في المنطقة، يجب أن نعزز الفكر السلمي، الحوار. أنا أرأس مركز أدم لحوار الحضارات، نحن مركز إقليمي في غزة، في الضفة الغربية، في إسرائيل، في الأردن، في مصر، ولدينا علاقات كبيرة جدا مع قادة الفكر الإسلامي في العالم. نحاول طرح فكر إسلامي معتدل يحترم الإنسان وكرامة الإنسان. إذا نجحنا في هذا الفكر وإذا نجحنا في هذا العمل هو الطريق الأقصر لهزيمة داعش والأفكار المتطرفة. نحن نحاول أن نصنع تكامل حضارات، حوار حضارات. أنا عندما أسست مركز أدم لحوار الحضارات، وأنا هنا أذكر صديقي فاذر أندرو وايت الذي عمل معي منذ أكثر من 15 سنة، ونحن نعمل أجل حوار الأديان، بناء الثقة بين الأديان. كيف يلتقي الشيخ المسلم والكاهن المسيحي والحاخام اليهودي، نلتقي على طاولة واحدة، نتحدث مع بعضنا البعض كأخوة في الدين. وبالتالي هذه الثقة بين الأديان إذا تعززت وإذا نجحنا فيها، أعتقد بأن نحن نكون قطعنا شوط كبير جدا. وأنا أقول نحن نجحنا، نلتقي سويا في كثير من المؤتمرات، نضع أفكار وخطط. أنا أقول للغرب انتبهوا إلى ما نقوم به نحن من عمل. نحن ما نقوم به من عمل أقصر الطرق للسلام الحقيقي.
Of course, these groundbreaking accords couldn't go untested. Soon after the Alexandria Accord was signed, I had a relapse in MS, and I landed back up in the UK in hospital. One day, I received a series of phone calls, the first from Yasser Arafat, then 3 minutes later from Michael Melchior, then Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel. They both told me the same thing. There was a dramatic standoff happening in Bethlehem that was threatening the peace which we had just managed to secure. Then the phone call from George Carey, the then Archbishop of Canterbury. I told him, "I'm ill in hospital, Your Grace." He said, "I know, Andrew, but they can't do this without you." I asked him, "Are you telling me to go back?" He said, "I'm afraid so, Andrew." So I discharged myself, I got on the plane and returned to Israel. When I got there, the situation was so intense, it was a time bomb that we had to defuse. The Israeli Defense Force had invaded Bethlehem and captured Palestinian militants. Dozens of them had fled into the Church of the Nativity. There were 200 civilians in the church, 12 of whom were monks. And the Israeli Defense Force thought that these people had been taken hostage by the militants.
This was a siege which lasted many, many days. It was on the front page everywhere. And it turned out that Arafat, at that time, was the Palestinian president. Arafat would not hear all the politicians that asked him to come. He was very not compromising. But what the Israelis didn't understand is that Arafat had a soft spot for religion. He was a very religious man. So when he was approached by the religious leadership, and Andrew was leading this negotiation, then it took half an hour, and he said, "What do you want? Which terms do you use?" I agree immediately, and the whole conflict was ended. That was it.
For most of my time in the Middle East, I was based in Iraq. I first visited the country in 1997 to try and form links with the Iraqi leadership. During that trip, I visited St. George's Church, the only Anglican church in Iraq. It was closed, dirty, and the only living things in the church were a few pigeons flying around. I started living permanently in Iraq in 2003, and one of the first things I did was to restore St. George's and reinstate regular services.
God says to all of us, "Come to me, let me take thought here." Amen.
Due to my high profile in the country, and due to the fact that I was seen as anti-war and anti the sanctions that Iraq had been under for 13 years, I was invited in 2002 to the most unpleasant dinner party of my life. A meal with Saddam Hussein's two sons, Uday and Qazi, because they wanted to see what I could do to prevent war. Those were difficult years. Everyone lived in terror of Saddam. And then the 2003 war broke out.
All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
After the coalition forces invaded Iraq, Baghdad became very unstable. Bombings and attacks every day. It was a total war zone. Eventually, it became too dangerous for expats to attend St. George's Church. So we started holding extra services in what had once been Saddam Hussein's throne room. I myself was kidnapped in 2004. And after that, I had to travel about with vastly increased number of bodyguards.
Is it dangerous just to sit around here like this?
Yeah, really dangerous.
No.
We're not sitting here if they've run out of benzene again.
No record, please.
We'll just drive. Too dangerous to be here.
No, this is our safe area.
Come on.
The next car is coming.
No, forget it. It's dangerous sitting here. But during the war, by 2005, St. George's Church had grown, and we had 6,500 people at the services each week. We served everybody. We had people from all denominations. They were all my family. We saw angels, healings, and even had the dead being raised to life. It was a glorious time in the midst of destruction.
The Lord is here. We're going to read Philippians. You know that He's glorious.
I must admit, I was in favor of the initial war to overthrow Saddam. But I was terribly wrong. Iraq after the war was far worse. I mean, after the coalition left, it really started to fall apart. Terrorist organizations rapidly established themselves. It became especially dangerous for Christians. I saw so many of our people killed. I counted one day, it was 1,272. And after that, I didn't count anymore. And then ISIS came. They were responsible for the cruelest persecution in recent years.
قمنا بها ننتصر عليه. أنا إذا ذهبت إلى المسجد لأصلي ركعتين أنتصر على الشيطان، إذا قرأت القرآن أو الكتاب المقدس أنتصر على الشيطان، ولكن كيف أنتصر على الشياطين البشرية؟ هذه التي يعتبروا تلاميذ أذكياء للشيطان الأساسي. هؤلاء هم الشياطين الذين نحن نعاني منهم. هؤلاء الشياطين الذين يحملون أفكار خطيرة جدا، يستخدموا الدين بطريقة ليس كما أرادها الله سبحانه وتعالى. يستخدم آيات القرآن الكريم وآيات الإنجيل وآيات التوراة.
So they set about systematically destroying Christians, Christian communities and churches across Iraq. So at the beginning of the conflict with ISIS, there were 1.3 million Christians in Iraq. We now think there is something like somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000. The Christians were evicted. They tried to force Christians to convert to Islam, and if they weren't prepared to, they were killed. So in terms of the numbers of people killed and homes destroyed and churches destroyed, it's very difficult to know the exact numbers because the country's still in chaos and we don't know the truth of what happened yet. We know there are mass graves. We don't know how many people's bodies are in them. What is clear is that a whole way of life was very nearly destroyed. Livelihoods have been destroyed, churches have been destroyed, homes have been destroyed, communities have been disrupted, families have been ripped apart. It will be at least a generation before they're able to rebuild back to the sort of lives they had before.
We believed after the Holocaust that was it. Humankind would wake up. You can't do new crimes against humanity. You can't have, again, whole peoples wiped out. But like we've seen now happen country after country. And yet, what do we see? We see this happening all over the world today. We see what's gone on in Syria, in Iraq. And it's devastating. And nobody can say that they don't know. You know, during During the Second World War, during the Holocaust, the leaders all knew, but the people didn't know. Now we all know. We all know because it's on the television screen in every single home.
I will never forget the day that my friend Jamal phoned me. He told me that Daesh, ISIS, had been at his house and had threatened to kill his children unless he renounced Jesus. I did it, he said. I renounced him. Jamal said, but I haven't really left Jesus. Do you think that Jesus will ever forgive me? I said, I may have done the same thing to spare my children from being burned alive in a cage. The next day, the story was a lot worse, and I really struggled to tell it. This time, ISIS came to the children and not the parents. They said, will you accept Islam as the way of God and Muhammad as the greatest prophet? The children refused. No, we won't leave Jesus, they said. We love him. ISIS killed them all and chopped off their heads. Do you know what the worst part is? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories just like that one.
اجانا تليفون احنا من شخص مجهول، يعني قال الموصل راح تسقط خلال 24 ساعة 48 ساعة. يعني احنا بهذا التليفون مال هذا الشخص بلغنا به الحكومة المركزية وحكومة إقليم كردستان. ورا أسبوع الجيش العراقي قام ينسحب من الموصل، دا يجي يمنع على القرى المسيحية اللي كان بها كراد تحت سيطرة الكراد يعني للإقليم كردستان. الكراد هم انسحبوا وطبوا داعش على القرى المسيحية. يعني أنا جاوي علي على البيت الصبح، يعني ثاني يوم قالوا نريد نشوف منو نحكي معانا ويا واحد. قلت له احكي معايا. قلت له تفضل. قال لازم تحطون كل شهر جزية على كل نفر 400,000، يعني بحدود $300 على كل نفر، أو تستسلمون، يعني أصير معاهم أستسلم وقاتل معهم. قلت له أنا ما أستسلم وأبقى على ديني، لأن أكو آية تقول لي ديني ولي دينكم. أنا ضربته هون بكلاشينكوف بالرقبة، فقدت الوعي، ما عرفت شو صار. بعدين من ذبوا ماي علي لقيت نفسي معلق تك رجل، يعني عندهم مركز قضاء الكيف، مركز شرطة. 45 يوم هو عندهم بالسجن كنت، يعني بالتعذيب، يعني اخذوني من البيت وهم علقوني، يعني مثل ما قلت لك قبل شوي، يعني صار ضرب بالصوت وبالصاعقات كهرباء. يعني حتى مرة جابوا طفل كانوا ينزلوني بالماء القذر يوميا، يعني هاي الشغلة. بعدين حكموني المحكمة، قال لي انت نحكم عليك بالاعدام رمي الرصاص. حط لي التاريخ يوم 26/9. بعدين وقفوني على هيك صحراء ترابي، يعني وقفوني وانا بس شنو مشدود كلي، يعني بس كلي دم، وفات 5 6 مسلحين يعني كانوا. يعني قال انت هذا يعني راح تنعدم، ما راح تتراجع عن قتله، هذا يعني عادي، انا راح اموت. بعدين اشو التليفون مال هذول واحد من ذول المسؤولين المجموعه اللي كان معهم، رن تليفونهم حكى معه، ما اعرف يعني ايش حكى، بس بعدين والله ما خلص تليفون قال عفوا لا تعدموا، قال شمروه هنا بالشارع. انا اقول لك انا ورا ما عافوني شافتني عائله يعني من الموصل، هي شالتني، يعني شافتني بالطريق، يعني فاقد الوعي، يعني بس كلي دم. ورا ما فتحت عيني لقيت نفسي بغرفة، يعني ما أعرف شو، يعني قلت خلاص أنا يم رب العالمين، يعني صاح مبدل ملابسي وغرفة كلها بيضة، قلت خلاص أنا يم الرب.
I didn't want to leave. You know, I used to say to my people, don't leave me, I'm not going to leave you. But they did leave Iraq. You can imagine thousands of people fleeing for their lives. You saw the pictures. They actually lived it. Meanwhile, I had $157 million bounty. A fact were placed on my head by ISIS. I was wanted dead or alive and was ordered by the Archbishop of Canterbury to leave Iraq. In other words, to protect my life. Andrew, he said to me, you are more used to us alive than dead. I left Iraq in 2014 and set up base in Jordan. Then something amazing happened. There I was in Amman, and within a few weeks, my people who had been in Mosul and Nineveh started fleeing to Jordan. So we were reunited not in Baghdad, but in Jordan. And that is where I am these days, taking care of those still in Jordan who survived ISIS. I'm traveling literally all over the world, raising global awareness of the persecuted church. And I'm doing it with so many other dedicated Christian leaders, like Father Khalil, who oversees our church in Amman and has taken in refugees. We also have a school, a housing relief project, as well as a medical and dental clinic, which Rabbi Eckstein from Israel and his charity, the Fellowship of Christians and Jews, have recently started to help us finance.
You know, when they first come here, and always we have new arrivals, all the time we have new arrivals. They came here very sad. First, because they left everything. They came here with nothing. And you know that winter is very, very cold in Jordan, okay? They suffer too much. They come to me and they ask help because really they feel that they are unable to support their family. Don't forget that they are not allowed to work. They don't have money. So my question, how they can live with human dignity?
I was asked the other day, tell me about a family who has suffered. And that was very difficult because everyone has suffered. Every family has suffered great pain.
داليا بهنام كنت عايشة ببرطلة يعني من قرية سهل نينوى حاليا مهجرين بعمان.
I'm Maryam. I'm Maryam Ala from Iraq, Bartella. I was live in this town. It's the town in north of Iraq. Near to Mosul, maybe 21 kilometers.
ثوابا حيلة طوائف، ثوابا إسلام، ثوابا مسيحيين، ثوابا نوع من اليزيديين، قليل من اليزيديين. تعايش موجود يوم، بس نفس الوقت قسم من ناشي لبن كوميو.
سهام بطرس شابة من العراق، من الموصل قرية برطلة. وإحنا أخني بلطلان من مافتن بطر أحداث يحصل الإرهابي وداعش.
And then I will leave with my family to Erbil. Also, it's north of Iraq. In this day, it was the bad day in whole my life.
الليلة السوداء، الليلة ليلة كومتا. بابا يا ليلي، ساعة 11 ماثا كامل، ما يعادل 1500 مسيحي، كلهن عرقهن وعفن، بس شميح الطلقات. فجوري فيل داعش كلهن عرقهن. بويا ليلة عبيران أرخت بلقي شيثة بشلة 8 شياثة. هل دعبيران العربل كم مستقبلي لن إيتاثة مليهن إيتاثة درتد إيتا شوارع دربيل مليهن ناشط وهم شوارع ليلة واثة. داعش قل كل منطقة وش قلن أملاك وكلن ناشي وكلن بيثوثين وكلهم ينظرين.
لا أكيد كلهم بلطن لبش ولا ختامة، لأنه يدعش يلي جملة إلين وعالم كلن أرقين ولا خلا بش فتامة بيشن بس الرابع عمر وبس، يعني هذا اللي بندرقي. كم أسرين أكيد وكم جبريهن مشلمي حيلة من كم عذبيهن لغبن مشلمي قتليهن ومن الناس حيلة كم بهدليهن.
يعني إحساسي ليه بدي أوصفني، لأنه ليش ليه أنا أصلاً حيسخ مني، لأنه داعش ليش قل لي بس أملاكا وأموالا، إيش قل لي حيلة من ديانة، يعني مش مهم من أملاكا وأموالا، لأنه مفارقة عن عوائلا، عن خوافا، عن نشوافا كلهن كده خبش الديرة، يعني كده خبش بدوكا خلنا لبش كذا، خلنا أخباري لبش احتمال لبش متدقق، يعني أبداً لا مناسباتا لا بأحزانا، يعني حتى يعني مستقبلاً قمقنويلي.
And when they start telling me how easy treated them, it's horrible. There is no one family arriving from Mosul without a tragedy. In each family, we have a tragedy. The father was killed, the mother was killed, one of the brother or the sister has been kidnapped. Last 2 months, we received Yusuf. They put on him benzene, just to oblige the family to leave Baghdad and to go out.
أنا سحر وهذا ابني يوسف، كنا ببغداد ساكنين، وزوجي كان عنده مطعم صغير بيبيع شاورما وأكلات سريعة. جوي ناس على زوجي بالمطعم قالوا له بتطلع من هون وبترحل أحسن إله. مين هذول ما بنعرف، بس إحنا سمعنا إنه هم داعش جايين بالمنطقة، عاملين خلية صغيرة بالمنطقة مع متخبائين، وداعش هم موجودين بالمنطقة. شو اسمه بعدين مرة ثانية يجوي عليه، قالوا له بدنا نكب عليك نفط وسخ مو النفط النظيف، بنحرقك إذا ما بترحلوا. فإجا حكالي، قلت له شو نسوي، يعني أمك مرة كبيرة وأنت كمان حتى إذا بنطلع على أي دولة عربية ما بتقدر تشتغل لأن عندك صدع، ما حدا بيشغلك بيخافوا. فقال لي رجلي أخاف يجي يحرقونا، خلي نطلع. قلت له وين بنروح إذا بنطلع، وين نروح إحنا؟ قلت له كلها بدها مصاري، منين نجيب احنا العيشة قوة عايشين، انت يوم بتشتغل 3 أيام 4 بالبيت. إلى أن إجوي ملثمين كبوا عليه بنزين وحرقوا لي إياه. طلعت بالباب مال البيت، طلعت وحاطين حرف نون على الباب، انتم مسيحيين نكسين، انتم مسيحيين نكسين. زين ظلت شوف اروح بالدوام بسكر الباب وبقعد، وين اروح؟ قلت اسلم امري لله هو بيحل لي اياها. لما طلعت على صريخ بالباب كله كان يشتعل بالنار، حاولت اطفيه وركضنا بيه على المشفى بعد ما رجعنا للبيت. بعدين دغري اجينا على هون، كثير بيصير اعصاب، بيقول صرت هيك مشوه انا، بعد ما بقدر اصير احس نفسي مثل الشباب. قلت له الله بيدبرها. مرات احس اني المذنب، اقول لو يعني مسافرين من البدايه. بعدين اقول يجوز هذا امر الله هو كتبه نشوف هذا الشيء.
Joseph, show us your arms. Can we see your arms? Is that where they threw the petrol?
على التيشيرت.
They threw it over your body and your arms?
حاولت اطفيه بعدين الى ان عجزت وشلحت الملابس على السرير.
بعدين الساعة ب9 ما كان في حد بالشارع، بالليل كانت. أنا طلعت قدام الباب فجوت للشباب علي، كانوا ملثمين شو اسمه، أنا هم داعش طبعا، وداروا علي بنزين. بعدين كانت هي هيك النار، وبعدين اشتعلت كتير وحركوني وراحوا. وبعدين بديت أصرخ، بعدين أمي جت تشحك الفلوس من عندي، فقدت الوعي. 3 أيام أنا فاقد الوعي.
كانوا شايلين المرايات كلها بالمستشفى حتى لا يعني لا يطلع بحاله. معزول ما يقبل يطلع، تدري 6 سنوات ما يقبل يطلع. بصعوبة اجانا، هسه ما قبل يجي.
أنا بتمنى يعني أطيب، أتمنى هذا اللي يصير. أريد أطيب بأسرع وقت. يعني بعد ما بتحمل، تعبت كثير، تعبت كثير.
For the time being, I have almost 600 families depending totally from the help of the church. They have no money. So can you imagine how they can live? They suffered and they sacrificed everything just to keep their faith in Jesus Christ. That's why I call them the living saints of the 21st century. They are in a very bad situation. They are suffering, but for the Lord, they told me, we are ready to do much more.
Lord Jesus, heal you.
The situation in the Middle East is very complex. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know that loving our enemies is a big part of it, and loving our Christian brothers and sisters, coming to their aid, helping them like the Good Samaritan did, we must do. Pretending it's not happening is not doing anything. It's not the answer. Silence, indifference, and denial are not a response. They are a major part of the problem. We cannot stand by and watch a generation of believers being wiped out. We cannot ignore the people who have lost everything for the sake of keeping their faith.
God has given us a free will to do absolute good and to do absolute evil. And therefore, we need to do the work of the Lord. This is what we need. This is what we're put in this world for. Otherwise, why do we live our lives?
I think we can destroy evil. We can overcome evil. By the way we live, by the way we talk, by the way we walk, by the way we act, by the way we treat people, by the way we handle things around. I mean, it's so important for us as a Christians to have our life really glorify the name of the Lord Jesus Christ.
We have to come all together. It's time to stand all together and to give a good testimony to all over the world that our faith in Jesus is the only way to make big change in this world. I hope that we as a Christian can come together.
So I think the top 4 needs of persecuted Christians, the things they need from us as their brothers and sisters in the West, are first, for us to get informed about what's going on. So I can say from my own personal experience, I had no idea of the degree of persecution that people are suffering. We hear about the smash because those stories make the news, but we don't hear about the squeeze. We don't hear about how people's lives are shrinking in the contexts in which they live. So I think getting informed is the first thing. The second thing, we need to pray for them. It means a huge amount to them to know that they're not forgotten, but they also understand how our prayers make a difference. The next thing that people can do is to give money. So for lots of Christians in countries where they're experiencing persecution, it's not possible for them to get work. So we were talking earlier about the refugees from Iraq and Syria who've ended up in Jordan who are unable to work there. So refugees can't find work, but people within country are not able to work either. So there's a lot of practical support that is needed in terms of providing the basics like food, shelter, medicines. We also need to keep providing Bibles and Christian literature. So the growing church in these countries, these secret believers, are so desperate for Bibles. And as they share the news of Jesus, they want to be able to give Bibles to others and so on. We take the Bible so much for granted, but it's gold. And it's gold to people in these countries. So we need money to be able to do these things. And finally, we want to bring pressure to bear on people in power to encourage them to ensure that in all these countries, Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights is actually being lived up to within the governance structure of the country. So Article 18 says everybody has the right to religious freedom, to change their religion, to talk about their religion, to express their beliefs. But many, many, many of the countries on the World Watch list, even if they've signed up to the declaration and so to Article 18, are not practicing it. And so we want to see governments in the West exert pressure on those governments to do so.
رسالتي لناشدي نقشيلي أنه المسيحي دائما قلبه طيب لي حتى من ند عدوه. المسيحي قلبه طيب حتى من ند عدوه. وأنا متعدين إلا أني آيسس بس مشيحة كامل سامحوهن.
انت رح تسامح هدول الناس عملوا فيك هيك؟ انا سامحتهم من زمان، سامحناهم. يعني اللي مريت الوضع يعني الله كتب لي حياة جديدة، وإن شاء الله يصير خير وسلام بكل أنحاء العالم. إحنا نتمنى هذا الشيء يعني بالحياة.
رسالتي دا كورين سورايد عالم بأنه الثبت بإيمانين ومسيحيتين بيسوع المسيح، ولعي فخلي مهما مضطهديلا وأون يسوع ميري مضطهديتم سبب شمي، فأروقهم دكفد مضطهديخن أروقهم لخضريتم صمخن.
عندك القوة إنك تسامحيهم؟
أكيد، ما أعرف أعقد. إحنا ما أعرف، إلا أنا ما بعرف أعقد على أحد أبدا. أقول هاي أمر من الله، إنه أشوف هذا الشيء بإذني، راضية بحكمة الله.
أنا مسامحة أعدائي، لأنه ربنا المسيح بالإنجيل إذا أعطاك هذا الخير أعطيه الأيسر.
People always ask me, why do you keep going back to the Middle East? I'll say it again. How can I not? How can I just sit by and do nothing while Christians are dying, while their lives are being destroyed? I will not sit back and do nothing. I will continue to devote my entire life to relieve human suffering. I will fight for peace and freedom until my last breath. I always tell them, the question is not what am I doing? The question is, what are you doing about it?
Man can live far from God, not outside God. God is wherever we are, even in suffering. To be indifferent to that suffering is what makes the human being inhuman. Indifference is not a response. Indifference is not a beginning. It is an end. Indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. Not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own.
Buka lana kaubai ai kana darf ahnan spachnen